trying to make time for my wife to be able to be alone, whether that's so she could be alone just to think. Like sometimes it's like when you're in the midst of like trying to homeschool and everything, like you just can't get away and think. You won't even really, you just kind of lose the vision of what you're even trying to do.
This podcast is brought to you by BJU Press Homeschool. Homeschooling is an exciting adventure we take with our children. One of the most challenging parts of this journey is choosing the curriculum you want to use. BJU Press Homeschool is a curriculum you can trust. All the books, resources, and videos have been designed with you and your child in mind. Their curriculum is educationally robust and rich, taking into account that children have different learning styles, strengths, and needs. Mom, you are in charge. BJU Press Homeschool is here to come alongside and support you. Do you need help with the teaching load, or is there a subject you just don't want to teach? Their amazing video courses are available for all grades and almost every subject. BJU Press Homeschool believes that homeschooling can produce a new generation of students who know God, love their neighbors, and stand firm in their faith. For more information, go to bjupresshomeschool.com. That's bjupresshomeschool.com. Hey everyone, welcome to the Zan Tyler podcast. I'm your host, Zan Tyler. This podcast is devoted to encouraging you in your homeschool journey through conversations with amazing homeschool leaders and advocates. I wanted to remind you to please subscribe or follow this podcast wherever you listen to podcasts. That may be Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcast. Please leave a review and rating, especially on Apple Podcast, if this show has helped you on your homeschool journey. It really helps the podcast out, and we sure do appreciate it. Also, we are now on YouTube, so if video is your style, please like and subscribe to the Zan Tyler podcast on YouTube. And be sure to go to the website, zantyler.com. You can find all my social handles there for the show, like Facebook and Instagram. You can also send me a message. So now with all of that out of the way, let me introduce you to my guest. My guest today is Paul Hastings. Paul is an award-winning podcaster, filmmaker, and entrepreneur. He is the host of Compelled, a podcast telling unique stories about God working through people's lives. Paul is also the homeschool father of 3, and both he and his wife were homeschooled. Paul, it is such a pleasure to have you today on the Zan Tyler podcast. Thanks so much for being with us today.
Well, thanks, Ann. It's a joy to be with you guys today.
It has been so much fun to follow you over the last 15 years or so of your life, all the work you used to do with Texas Homeschool Coalition, and now being a follower and lover of your podcast. So what an exciting life you've had.
Yeah, it's, as my parents would probably say, like, oh man, it's too much excitement at all. Like, can't this guy slow down? So exciting is one word for it, I suppose.
That's good. Well, you don't want to be bored. So tell us how you got interested in homeschooling.
Yeah, great question. So it is an interesting story. Actually, I was homeschooled.
Oh, you were?
I was, yeah. So the way it happened was that my dad, back in like 1980 or something, he was a young single man, didn't have kids, didn't even have a girlfriend. But one day he was driving, I think to college or work or something, and he heard a radio broadcast with Dr. James Dobson and Raymond Moore talking about homeschooling. And of course, tons of other people have heard that same series of broadcasts. And so he was just one of those folks who heard it. And he said, wow, that's such a cool idea. I'm totally going to do that, even though like he didn't have any prospects to get married or anything like that. And then fast forward in time, he eventually married my mom. And she immigrated from Thailand when she was 17 years old. And in Thailand, she had been a terrible student, dropped out of high school, came to America, enrolled, but she didn't speak English. And so she was a terrible student here in the U.S. also. So she dropped out of high school as well. And so got her GED. And then my dad, again, he's the one who heard the radio broadcast. He actually was a high school dropout as well. And so he had his GED. So these two high school dropouts met each other, got married, and thought, hey, we should homeschool our children, and of course, and that's what we tell people, and that is all true. Of course, there's many more details. My dad was actually working on his PhD at the time, and things like
Minor
that. But,
details.
yeah, minor details, but it makes for a great story, though.
It is a great story. It is a great story. Oh my
Yeah,
goodness. So were you homeschooled all the way through?
I was. So I have an older brother. He was born in 1985. I came along in 1989. We have a younger sister who was born in 1993. All three of us were homeschooled K through 12. And my brother ended up going to Rice University in Texas and got his double major in physics and in math, and then ended up getting his PhD at Berkeley University in sociology. And today he is a professor of sociology at Colorado State University,
Wow.
teaching all the public school kids,
That's amazing. That's awesome.
That's right. That's right. My sister was smart. I was relatively smart, so it's a real homeschool success story in some ways.
That is really amazing. So did you know, first I got to go back to that radio broadcast. Dr. Moore did a couple of broadcasts with James Dobson, and it was amazing because that was one of the things that was so confirming for me back in the 80s when we started homeschooling and having all the legal problems we had. And then we heard like probably the 1984, 1985 broadcast, but we started a homeschooling organization and we used to ask the question, how did you hear about homeschooling? Because when we started this organization, it was still, not everybody had heard of it. 90% of the people the first year who joined had heard that broadcast.
Wow.
So you're a podcaster. I'm a podcaster. I can only hope what we're doing here today can have, a millionth of that type of impact on people who are listening, because those one or two broadcasts were amazingly effective in bringing in almost a whole new movement.
It's true.
So that's pretty exciting. So did you know all along that you would homeschool your kids? Did your wife homeschool or?
Oh, yes to both. So my wife, she was homeschooled as well. She grew up in Kansas, and her parents had started homeschooling way back in the day also. And so I eventually met my wife through strange circumstances at a mutual friend's wedding type thing in a totally different state. And we eventually got married. And so both of us, of course, being homeschooled ourselves, K through 12, it seemed like a logical decision to homeschool our own kids. And so we now have, let me think here, we have a 5-year-old who is now, I guess she's in kindergarten. It would be the technical term, but we've been homeschooling since birth, of course. We've got a 3-year-old and a 2-year-old and another child arriving in April.
Oh, so that's amazing. You'll have 4, 5 and under.
That's right. We reminded my wife of that many times now. She's like, "Oh, Paul, how did this happen? What happened?"
Well, that's pretty exciting. That is really exciting. So you you are homeschooling from birth, as you say. When when you get bit by the homeschool bug, that all of life becomes your schoolroom and the world is your classroom and all of that. So are you doing anything yet with your 5-year-old or?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
So my wife is very active with our 5-year-old. They use, and I'm gonna butcher all the curriculums, guys. Please forgive me ahead of time. I'm so sorry, but they use several different curriculums, different subjects, and different types of unit studies. They're doing a lot of things. They do a separate, kind of like a Bible study every morning. They do a lot of writing and reading. They're doing some math already.
That's amazing.
And our 5-year-old's now starting to read to me and to the other kids, which is really exciting and fun. So it's been a really exceptionally cool thing to see our kids starting to learn. And of course, our 3-year-old, he doesn't really do as much, right? Like we're just doing good to get him to, eat his peas and broccoli and, a lot of, kind of like those parenting things more at this point, But he is absorbing a lot, actually. And it's surprising. He's actually quite good with math already. And most of that he's picked up just from watching his sister being taught already.
That is really amazing. It sure is a fun way to raise kids, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
So, all right. So now you actually used to work for the Texas Homeschool Coalition.
That's right.
And did you start that in high school, or had you graduated, or how did that happen?
Great question. So in Texas, just like many other states, I'm sure in South Carolina, many other states, they have this kind of like annual event where your state homeschool organization will sponsor all these homeschoolers to come to the Capitol for one day to learn how the process is done, how to make laws, and and how to pass legislation. And when I say sponsor, I don't mean like, paying people's, that doesn't happen, right? But it's like an event, right? It's just an event that's sponsored by your, state homeschool organization.
Like your day at the Capitol or rally day. Yes.
Rally day, Capitol day. There's Pi Day, I think, at some states. So they have other days they call them. So in Texas, our state legislature meets once every 2 years.
Yes, which is phenomenal.
It is phenomenal. It is phenomenal.
We should all be so blessed.
That's right. That's right. If only DC would do that too.
Yes.
So as a 12-year-old, though, that was the first time my family went to the Capitol Days event. So we would go to that event. In Texas, we would actually hold the event 4 times a year. So it would be once every month during the legislative session in the spring. So my family, we were like super into it. So we started going when I was 12 years old, and we'd go to every single event when I was 12, and then when I was 14, and then when I was 16.
Oh, so
and then
you would go 18. To all 4?
Yeah. We would go to all 4.
Oh, you were hardcore. Okay. I would have loved your family. Hardcore. Okay.
I'm sure you would have. So we were like super hardcore because this was really important. And we lived in Austin. So we were only like an hour away from the Capitol. So it wasn't that hard for us to do.
Right.
And so, of course, doing all of that, I got to know some of the people that worked at THSC and the Lambert family. They were the ones that were head of the THSC at the time. And when I say THSC, that stands for Texas Homeschool Coalition. And so when I think I was 20 years old, and I was trying to do college on my own. I was getting my degree online from Thomas Edison State University. Mm-hmm. And I was still living at home, and I had a part-time job as a computer programmer and stuff. And somewhere in the mix, Tim Lambert realized that I lived in Austin, and he's just like, "Oh, Paul, this next legislative session is going to start. Can you just come and, help us out, like maybe 10 hours a week?" Because he lived about 7 hours away from the Capitol, so there was occasions where it's like it didn't make sense for him to like fly down when he could just send someone who lived locally. So I said, sure, 10 hours a week, no problem, right? And so that first week of the legislature started in 2011 is when it started. So I was I think I was 21 at the time. I think I just turned 21, and so I show up to my first week at the legislature, and I'm gonna represent homeschooling and what homeschoolers believe and all this stuff. And I guess I did a good job at it. I really enjoyed it. It was very meaningful. And it just shocked me how much of an impact just regular, ordinary people could have on legislators just simply by being there and talking about stuff.
Yes.
And it was really meaningful.
Making those relationships.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
Yep.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Oh, that's exciting. So how long did you do that?
I did that for, I think, right around 3 years. I started when I was 21. I finished when I was 23. Had a great time, great experience with them. By the time I was 23, I realized I didn't want to do, political work for the rest of my life.
Right.
And so I eventually left the organization, but still stayed super good friends with everyone at the organization since. And basically became sort of like their unofficial consultant. And so I've continued to help them out and volunteer with them for the last decade or so. And then last year, I joined their organization on their board of directors.
Oh, that's pretty exciting. Well, it's so great. Now we see it with our organization and THSC to have these second generation homeschoolers come through. And the knowledge you have is so much greater than the knowledge we had when we started an organization, and basically we were learning about homeschooling as we were going,
Yeah.
And so for you to come on board and have that wealth of just family history and personal history, that's pretty amazing. So I have to ask you this about your work as an intern. Did it really stay a 10-hour a week job?
Oh, no. That's a great question. I forgot. So the first week, it really was 10 hours. But the second week,
one week out of 2 years.
The second week was 20 hours. The third week was 30 hours. And by the sixth week, it was 60 hours.
Oh, my word.
So I actually had to stop the schooling that I had to quit college to just finish the semester working for THSC, actually, because I felt like it was really important legislation that we were working on and everything.
Yeah.
And so it was just crazy. So at the end of that, little miniature internship I did with them, they asked me to come work for them full time. So I ended up moving up to Lubbock, which is 7 hours away, and lived up there, worked in their policy department and their marketing department, and did that until eventually I left.
So what did you do when you were marketing?
Great question. So Most of it was related just trying to figure out like how in the world can we help homeschoolers understand what our state organization has been doing to help protect their rights. Because sometimes also like, a lot of homeschoolers kind of unfortunately end up homeschooling in sort of this silo, thinking that like, hey, I'm
They're
free to
all
homeschool.
alone. Yes,
I'm all
yes.
alone. It's free to homeschool. It must have always been this way, and just completely clueless as to like, hey, actually just 10 years ago, you might have gone to jail for this, right? Like, and they didn't actually know that, And so it's actually really important for people to stay plugged in with the state organization because the state organization is the one that's monitoring all of the legislation that's filed the following year. In fact, while I was working with THSC during that time, we had a bill that was filed, and some legislation affects homeschooling directly, but much of it is parental rights related. And while we were working for the legislature in 2013, I kid you not, some legislators filed a bill that would basically allow doctors to pull the plug on children that were in critical condition without informing the parents. And the bill surprisingly had an enormous amount of support and actually was on the verge of passing until our organization became aware of it and then alerted our homeschool community. And of course, we barraged the state capitol with just oodles of phone calls, and the bill eventually did die. And we worked with several other organizations trying to kill that bill together. And of course, that's an extreme example. But I shudder to think like, man, if we had not had a state organization and hadn't been able to kind of pull all of these parents together, like that legislation really could have passed. And in Texas, doctors could pull the plug on your kid without telling the parent that the kid's about to die. I mean, crazy stuff like that.
Well, and then it would have moved to other states. And so by squelching it there, that's a pretty big save legislatively right there. That's amazing.
Yeah.
THSC today still has that heritage of working for parental rights because parental rights affects all of us.
That's right. That's right. In fact, we say that without the right, if you as the parent don't have the right to control and to bring and control the upbringing and education of your child, then you don't have the right to homeschool either, right? If it's a state's job to choose everything for your kid, then you have no rights at all. And so it really comes back to the fundamental right. Yeah.
So I think this idea of internships is so important for high school and college students because, I mean, you ended up choosing not to be politically active as your vocation for the rest of your life, but all the things you learned in the process is really amazing and has set the tone somewhat for the things you've done, even as an entrepreneur.
Yeah, that's right. That's really true. In fact, even right now, so like even though I left the organization at age 23, I still stayed really plugged in with the political community. And I would say that, when my wife and I vote, we're probably some of the most educated voters on almost all the issues when we go to vote.
Right.
We vote on every single issue all the way down to the bottom of the ballot because everything matters. And, so much of even if you're voting for the dog catcher is the first step on the political ladder to move up the rungs, right? So everything matters.
Yeah, it does. Everything matters. And you should always vote and you should always take your kids with you to vote.
Yeah.
So how would you like today with homeschooling, with parents who are homeschooling in high school and they haven't had the wealth of knowledge or the background in homeschooling you had, how would you encourage them to find meaningful internships for their teenagers?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say first off, reach out to your local homeschool organization. So that could either be your local, co-op, because your co-op might, for whatever reason, be plugged in with different businesses that have sponsored different events that they've had, perhaps. And so that might kind of lead you like, oh, okay, there's some family-friendly organizations in the first place. And I reach out to your state organization. I know of at least I think actually 3 state organizations that have an internship, very well-developed internship program. That's in Texas, Colorado, and Indiana. They both have like these awesome little programs that they develop basically to allow your high school senior or junior really get plugged into the political process or into the marketing process of how their organization operates. And they'll give them real responsibilities of things that actually need to get done. It's a really great, real life experience that you can get. There's another program if your kid is out of high school, but they're in college or they're still trying to figure out what their whole life is about and everything. One program that I recommend is called a Leadership Academy. That's based down here in Texas. And basically, you'll have the opportunity to work for several businesses. You'll have to move to Texas to do that. But you'll get a chance to work for multiple businesses, and you'll be rotated. There's a series of mentors and lecturers. I'm one of the mentors that's part of the program. And then one other program I'm aware of, which is great for internships, is called Praxis. And that's for kids that are basically have just graduated high school, but they don't really want to go to college, or maybe they do want to go to college, but they're not sure if they want to plunk down the money for it. You can enroll at Praxis, and I think the website is called discoverpraxis.org, I think. Yeah, go ahead.
That's just so exciting. And so if you're a parent out there with a teenager, the point is, whether these things are available in your state or not, get really creative with your children, find out their passions or the things you would like for them to be involved in. Some things aren't a passion, they just need to know, and see what you can find in terms of an internship. Some are paid, some are unpaid, but we always gave high school credit for internships.
Oh, yeah.
And,
yeah.
And it's a great way to set themselves apart too in the college application process.
Yeah,
when you've got
absolutely.
real world business skills or lobbying skills or marketing skills or whatever.
Yeah.
So, okay, I want to ask you this question, Paul. You grew up in a homeschooling family, and now you're about to have 4 kids under 5. As a homeschooling dad, what can you do to support your wife?
Oh, man, that's a really great question. That's one that my wife and I still talk about like every week at least. So I could not say like, oh, I'm an expert. I'm actually not an expert. I'm just literally fumbling my way through this also. So I would love to ask someone like your husband, Joe, like, dude, what in the world do I need to do here? You're like, what needs to happen? I will say one thing that we have found helpful is trying to make time for my wife to be able to be alone, whether that's so she can be alone just to think. Like sometimes it's like when you're in the midst of like trying to homeschool and everything, like you just can't get away and think. You won't even really, you just kind of lose the vision of what you're even trying to do.
Yes, that's right.
So this weekend, actually, she's going to be gathering with a handful of other friends, and they'll be getting away for like a 3-day ladies retreat just by themselves. So I'm the one who's going to watch the other 3 kids, the 5-year-old, the 3-year-old, and the 2-year-old. So if you think of it, pray for me, actually. But I'll be watching them for the next 3 days here. So that's just the one way that I could think of that was practical that we've been doing that's been helpful so far.
Yeah, well, I think you probably have as much energy as your 3 preschoolers. So,
I hope so.
So, hey, let's talk about what you are doing now, Paul, in terms of your podcast, Compelled, and tell us the story of how this came to be.
Great question. Yeah. So 5 years ago, my wife and I began praying and asking the Lord if there was something else that I should be doing as a career path. So at the time, I told you that early on, I had worked in the political arena with Texas Homeschool Coalition. Eventually, I left them. I still stayed in the political arena working for different clients, but by 2018, I was like pretty burned out with politics. And so we began praying, asking God, like, hey, are there other things that we could do besides just politics? And around that time, we were at a Christian film festival, had met a lot of people, and I don't know, I was just really inspired by hearing stories. And my wife and I, we made a list of just different assets and relationships and skills and experiences that we had over the years. And we're just brainstorming things. And eventually, at some point, we realized that we felt as though we knew an abnormal number of people that had exceptional testimonies, how God had transformed them or had saved them. And we just thought, man, every time I hear those stories, I'm just like, wow, that's amazing. That's crazy. But we just knew so many people like that. It was just weird, right? And so we just thought, well, maybe this is just a sign from God that we should make some video testimonies, right? Just record a few of these and just put them out for the world to see. And so before I pulled the plug, though, or pulled the trigger on, like, okay, I'm going to make these video testimonies and go out and buy this equipment. So I thought, you know what? That sounds like a lot of money, time, and expense. Why don't we just do the podcast at first? Because, how hard can that be? It's just audio only,
Right. You're right.
And so in my ignorance, I called up a friend of mine. I said, hey, bro, he was a professional film editor. And I said, hey, bro, I'm going to launch this podcast. I'm going to be so good at it. It's going to be so fast, so easy. I want you to edit it for free. And and so in his ignorance, he said, sure, And so that's how the podcast started. I know. We had no idea what we were getting ourselves into. And so it's now fast forward 5 years later. Now we're still podcasting along, and our show is called Compelled, and we interview people with unique stories how God has changed or transformed their life, and we add sound effects and music and professional narration. And we spent about 40 hours crafting together each episode to really turn it into this
That's
audio
amazing.
experience. And we release them for free, just like the Bible's for free. So
Yeah.
that's what we do. Yeah,
Well, that is exciting. I think we share the same sponsor. I think BJU Press Homeschool
that's right.
is one of your sponsors, and the sponsor of the Zan Tyler podcast as well. So that's a fun shared fact.
That's right.
So tell us how you find your stories. Are people coming to you now? And you're going to run a clip for us in a few minutes. How did she come to you? How do you find these stories?
That's a great question also. So normally the stories now come to us. It's either through listeners who have heard our show. They'll contact us and they'll say like, "Hey, I'd like to nominate someone for their testimony." And then we'll take that under consideration. At this point, we've probably got about 500 names on our spreadsheet of
Wow.
potential guests we'd like to interview at some point in the
Amazing.
future. So obviously we can't interview everybody, and so again, it's a really deep, it's a big commitment also because we're going to spend a lot of money and time making one single episode. So we'll think about it really deeply before we choose somebody. And then normally what happens is that if I'm going to be traveling or on vacation or for work, then I will reach out to a whole bunch of guests all in one geographic area. So for example, a couple weeks from now, I'm heading to Orlando. So I've already emailed about 10 potential guests that we have in the Orlando area and said like, "Hey, I'm here for these 4 days. Are you available?" I'll show up, I'll do the interview. And then my team and I will spend about a week, maybe 2 weeks, prepping the episode, and then we'll release all the episodes in different seasons. So our next season comes out in June. But the clip, can I tell your audience about the clip they're about to hear?
Absolutely.
Okay, so the clip you're about to hear is from one of our guests, and her name is Hannah Overton, and she was actually a homeschool mom. I think she had 6 kids, ages, and I'm going to butcher the ages. I think it was like ages 12 and under. So 6 kids. Her youngest was 7 months at the time that the story happens. They were in the process of adopting a little boy from their church. He was in foster care and he'd been coming to their church for quite some time. And her little girls had gotten to know this little boy in their Sunday school class and found out he didn't have a mom or dad. And so they wanted to adopt him. And so his name was Andrew. And so Andrew came and joined their family, was living with them. Life was great. Everyone was excited. But unfortunately, this little boy died while she was caring for him. And there's a whole backstory to how that ended up happening. But what happened was that the state prosecutors basically came because it was a foster care child. CPS became very interested right away, and they eventually ended up falsely accusing Hannah of murdering this little boy that was in their care. And so Hannah was then, I think it took about 18 months for this case to go to trial. And the prosecutors actually hid physical evidence from the jury, actually proving her evidence. And that's a whole other story. Like, why in the world did that even happen? How can you get away with that? That's not part of the story, though. The story is about Hannah believing that God was going to rescue her from that courtroom. And instead, the courtroom comes back with a guilty verdict, and they sentenced her to life in prison. And so she leaves her family, and that's where the story picks up.
Yeah, it is a powerful story. I had the 10-minute clip you sent. I couldn't stand it. So last night I'm up half the night. I didn't just listen to the clip. Then I'm watching all the news stories that were attached to it and trying to find out more about our ministry. And, so it is, man, you have done an amazing job. And, before we get to the clip, one thing I want to say is I was just reading a book and the author was saying so many of our ministries in life are born out of our greatest pain.
Yeah.
And, I think about being threatened with jail and starting a homeschooling organization, which is very minuscule compared to what Hannah went through. And so now I know she and her husband actually have a ministry to women in prison, and she led several people to the Lord. I don't want to give it all away, but it's such a great story. You just have to listen to it.
It really is. It really is.
Thanks, Paul. You have done a great job of setting up that story for us that you've covered in your podcast, Compelled. And now we are going to listen to a 10-minute clip.
Because probably I had been raised on a missionary base, I had seen God step in and save the day so many times.
Yeah.
I had watched as, money was provided the day before something was needed. And I just expected that God would come in and save the day on my time schedule. The morning that I left before my verdict, I didn't even, I kissed my kids goodbye, but I didn't prepare them for that I might not come home. I didn't expect that I wasn't going to come home. I had, a 8-year-old, a 6-year-old, a 5-year-old, a 3-year-old, and a 7-month-old.
Yeah.
That I left at home with my husband.
The decision was immediately devastating. Hannah had entered the courtroom a free woman, fully expecting to be declared not guilty, but instead was escorted away handcuffed as a convicted murderer. Larry would have to tell their children what had happened to Mom.
He stared out of a window for a few hours, and the kids were with my pastor, and then he was like, I need to go home and tell them, and he just told them that some people believed some lies about me and that I had to go to jail until we could prove the truth.
Hannah was immediately sent to county jail and locked away in solitary confinement. Because of the nature of her conviction, she could never have physical contact with her children ever again. God had abandoned her. Or had he?
I was in complete shock, and I don't remember the next 5 days. I was totally in shock. My attorneys came to the police station with me. And they tell me stories of in the county jail, the sheriff actually let them stay with me for hours, and I was crying, I can't do this, I can't do this. A few weeks later, there was a point when I was very, very depressed. As we spoke about a little bit earlier, I had thought God was going to come in and save the day, and he didn't do that. In my perspective, God had failed.
Yeah.
And I was trying to figure out how God could love me and allow this to happen to me.
Yeah.
And I was in solitary confinement because of all the media for the first 5.5 months. And I was alone. I was only allowed out of my cell to shower in the middle of the night. And I was very, very depressed. I wasn't eating. I wasn't sleeping. Every time I would try to go to sleep, I would have nightmares that I couldn't get to my kids and they were hurting. And so the nightmares were even worse than it was when I was awake, so I was scared to go to sleep. Because in my dreams, they would be drowning in a car and I couldn't get to them or whatever, different things like that.
Yeah.
And anyway, I had come to a point where I just felt like I couldn't do it anymore. And I was planning to call my husband to tell him, because I got a phone call every so often in the middle of the night when I could call him and talk to him for a few minutes. And I was going to call him to tell him that I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't eat, I couldn't sleep, and I was getting sicker. And my plan was, I wasn't telling him I was going to kill myself, but I was telling him I was going to die of a broken heart. So I called him, or I went to try to call him, and little did I know that earlier that day, God is so cool, because my son was trying to go to sleep and he was crying. My oldest, he's 8, and he was crying. He was telling his daddy, I can't do this. I can't do this. And how can I live without my mama? And Larry left him. And he said, can you just read this right now? Read your Bible for a minute, and I'll be right back. And he left because he didn't know what to say. He was completely overwhelmed by that question. And he went to the garage and cried. And when he went back in, Isaac was not crying anymore. He was smiling. And he said, Daddy, look. And he opened up his Bible that Larry had told him to read for a minute. He says, it says right here, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And in that childhood faith, he read that, he believed that, and he said, we can do this.
Yeah.
And he said, you need to tell Mama when she calls, tell her that the Bible says we can do all things. And so when I called, ready to tell Larry that I was going to, die of a broken heart, before I got that out, he was able to tell me that story about how, God says in his word, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me.
Wow.
And, that helped carry us through.
It became clear that God was ready to meet Hannah every step of the way. Whenever she needed him most, He was there.
I was throwing a fit one day. I was, just telling God how unfair it was. How can you say you love me and I'm in this prison and my babies need me, my husband needs me, I need to be home. In the midst of this fit, I wore myself out crying, and the last thing that I said to God was, I can't even see the flowers, and I fell asleep. Well, God loved me so much that even in the midst of that fit, where I'm telling him he doesn't love me, he heard that, and a friend of mine woke up in the middle of the night with this intense desire to get me flowers. And she tells her husband, I've got to go get her flowers. And he's like, you can't. She's in the county jail. You can't get her flowers. She's like, no, I have to. I don't know what I'm going to do with it, but I have to. And after a bit of an argument, she got up and went to the grocery store and bought flowers and went to the county jail and was like, I don't know what I'm supposed to do with these, God, but I feel like you told me to buy flowers. And she put them in the no parking sign. And little did she know, I was on the 6th floor, but when I looked out my window, that's what I could see. That my little bit of the real world that I could see was that no parking sign. And I looked down the next morning at those flowers. It's like, now I look back and, it makes me want to cry that God bought me flowers at the time.
Yeah.
I was still a bit of a brat in the mood I was in, feeling abandoned by God. And I was like, that's not funny, God.
After almost half a year in solitary confinement in county jail, Hannah was transferred to a maximum security prison where she was introduced to another world.
What was your communication with your family?
About once a month, my husband would bring the kids up for a 2-hour visit through bulletproof glass. He came every weekend. The church helped pay for gas and watch the kids and all kinds of stuff so that he could come. And he came every weekend, and we had contact visits. So we would sit at opposite sides of a table, but we could hold hands. But because my case involved a child, I couldn't have that with the children. So I had to see them through bulletproof glass, and he brought them up once a month.
Slowly, Hannah began to adjust to her new life in prison.
So over the next few months, as I began to heal and I began to to get used to life in prison and what the day-to-day was going to be like, I felt like God was saying to me that in his hands, I had a big purpose. And he had a purpose for what he was doing. And I needed to trust him. I might not understand his plan, but I needed to trust his heart. There was this lady, and at the time, she was the head of the Wiccan Circle, and she was
in prison. The Wiccan Circle.
The Wiccan Circle, and she was very, very scary, very dangerous. And I was put in a job where she was supposed to train me, and she was very angry with me because I kept crying, and she's like, "You can't cry in prison," Except she didn't say it that nicely, but so she kept, she kept yelling at me for being a crybaby. And finally one day she said to me, she said, "You need to get over this, and you need to realize that this is your home." And I was like, "This will never be my home." And she said, No, this is your home. And she said, "Now you say that you believe in God, right?" I said, "Yeah." She's like, "So if your God is so powerful, then he's got some purpose for you being here, or he wouldn't have put you here. So either you believe in him or you don't. Is this your home or not?" And I was mad at her. I was like, "How could you say that to me? This is not my home." And so I went back to to my dorm after work, and I was telling God all about how this wasn't fair. And I opened up my Bible, and in Acts, there's a place in Acts that says that God decides exactly when and where you are to live. And I opened it up to that scripture, and I was like, "Oh, wow." Okay, God.
Yeah.
And it was like God was telling me, I am in control, and I did decide exactly when and where you were to live.
Yeah.
And you have to give in and realize that this is my plan for you right now. And there's a purpose. And so at that point, I repented for being so upset, and I was like, "I don't know that I can ever call this home, God, but I understand that you have me here, and that there's a reason for you having me here."
Well, Paul, thank you so much for being with us today. Your whole life is compelling. So what a great podcast that you are doing on the stories of other people. So tell people who are listening today how they can find you and hear more of your podcasts.
Sure thing. So they can find me at compelledpodcast.com. And of course, if they want to hear all of Hannah's story, they can listen to all of that. It's episode 16. So if you search for Compelled in your podcast app right now, or go to compelledpodcast.com, you look for episode 16 and find the story on Hannah Overton. And the story is entitled Falsely Accused and Sentenced to Life in Prison.
Well, thank you so much for being with us. I can't wait to see what the Lord continues to bring to you and your family. Paul, thanks
you,
so
Zan.
much.
Appreciate it.
Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope this was encouraging and inspiring for you. If you would like more information, you can find me at zantyler.com. Until next time, see you later.